What happens when a single moment at a wedding changes everything you thought you knew about yourself? This is about David, a 29-year-old who thought he had his life figured out until one dance request from his best friend's mother turned his entire world upside down. The truth that came out that night wasn't just shocking, it was life-changing in ways no one could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Chen had always been the reliable one, the friend who showed up early to help set up parties, who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders, who never missed a wedding invitation. At 29, he worked as an architectural consultant in downtown Seattle, lived in a converted loft that he'd spent 2 years renovating himself, and maintained a small but solid circle of friends he'd known since college. His best friend Marcus was getting married to Elena on a crisp October afternoon at a vineyard outside the city. David had been Marcus's roommate for 4 years, his groomsman at every milestone, and the person Marcus called when he needed to talk through cold feet 3 weeks before the wedding. David had reassured him then, told him that Elena was perfect for him, that marriage was just the next logical step. He believed it too, even if something about weddings always left him feeling oddly empty. The ceremony was beautiful in that way that expensive weddings always are. White chairs arranged in perfect rows facing a gazebo draped in eucalyptus and cream roses. Elena looked radiant in her grandmother's lace dress, and Marcus couldn't stop grinning as she walked down the aisle. David stood with the other groomsmen, adjusting his navy tie and smiling at all the right moments, but his mind kept wandering to the stack of blueprints waiting on his desk at home and whether he'd remembered to water his plants. The reception was held in a restored barn on the property, fairy lights strung between wooden beams and tables set with mason jar centerpieces. David found himself seated at a table with Marcus's cousins and their spouses, making polite conversation about real estate prices and weekend hiking trails. He nursed a whiskey and watched the dance floor fill up as the sun set behind the vineyards. Marcus's mother, Patricia, had always been kind to David. She was one of those effortlessly elegant women who seemed to have stepped out of a different era, with silver hair that caught the light and a way of making everyone feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. She'd treated David like a second son over the years, sending him care packages during finals week in college and always asking about his work when he visited Marcus's family home. The DJ had just started playing something slow and romantic when Patricia appeared beside David's chair. She was wearing a deep purple dress that complemented her silver hair, and there was something different about her expression tonight. Not sad exactly, but thoughtful in a way that made David pay attention. She leaned down slightly and spoke just loud enough for him to hear over the music. "David, would you dance with me before I change my mind about something?" The request was unusual enough that David didn't hesitate. He set down his drink and stood, offering her his arm as they made their way to the edge of the dance floor. Other couples swayed around them, lost in their own worlds, while David and Patricia found a spot near the back where the lights were dimmer. Patricia was a good dancer, leading when David seemed uncertain and following when he found his rhythm. They moved together comfortably for a few minutes, not talking, just existing in the gentle bubble of music and movement. David was starting to relax when Patricia spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "David, I need to tell you something that I've been carrying for almost 30 years. Something about your father." The words hit David like cold water. His father had died in a car accident when David was 6 months old. His mother Rachel had raised him alone, never remarrying, always speaking of his father with a mixture of love and sadness that made David feel like he was missing a fundamental piece of himself. He'd grown up with stories and photographs, but no real memories of the man whose eyes he'd apparently inherited. "What about my father?" David asked, his voice tight with sudden tension. Patricia's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "Your father and I had an affair, David. For 2 years, while I was married to Marcus's father and while your mother was pregnant with you. It ended when your father died, but not before." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Not before we fell in love. Real love. The kind that changes everything." David stopped dancing. The music continued around them, but he felt like the world had tilted off its axis. "Why are you telling me this now?" Patricia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because Marcus is marrying Elena. and I'm watching them start their life together. And all I can think about is how your father and I never got that chance. How we had to hide what we felt, sneak around, pretend it didn't matter. And because you look so much like him, David. Every time I see you, I see the man I never got to grow old with. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they wanted to cross. David felt a strange mixture of emotions he couldn't name. Betrayal on behalf of his mother. Anger at being kept in the dark, but also something else. A weird sense of relief, as if a question he'd never known how to ask had finally been answered. "Does my mother know?" he asked. Patricia shook her head. "I don't think so. Your father was going to leave Marcus's father for her, but then the accident happened. After that, I couldn't bear to add to her grief. She'd lost her husband and the father of her child. What good would it have done to tell her he'd been planning to leave his family for someone else?" David realized they were still holding hands, still standing in the middle of the dance floor while other couples moved around them. He felt like he was seeing Patricia for the first time, not as Marcus's elegant mother, but as a woman who'd carried a secret love and loss for 3 decades. "Why tell me now, though? Why tonight?" Patricia smiled sadly. "Because I'm 72 years old, David, and I've spent 30 years wondering what would have happened if your father had lived. Would we have been happy? Would we have been good together? Would you have grown up calling me something other than Mrs. Morrison?" She paused, looking around at the wedding celebration surrounding them. "And because watching Marcus and Elena today, I realized that some chances only come once. Some truths are worth sharing, even if they're complicated." They started dancing again, slower this time, both of them lost in their own thoughts. David found himself studying Patricia's face, looking for signs of the woman his father had fallen in love with. She was still beautiful, with laugh lines around her eyes and a gracefulness that came from decades of knowing exactly who she was. "Was he happy?" David asked eventually. "With my mother, I mean." "Before he died." Patricia considered the question carefully. "He loved your mother, David. That was never in question. But love is complicated. Sometimes you can love someone and still feel like something's missing. Your father was a good man, caught between 2 different kinds of happiness." The song ended, but they kept swaying slightly, neither ready to break the spell of honesty that had settled between them. David felt like he was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, holding information that could change how he understood his entire life. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Now that you've told me this." Patricia's smile was gentle but tired. "Nothing, sweetheart. I just wanted someone else to know that your father was more than the stories your mother tells, more than the man in the photographs. He was complicated and flawed and capable of great love, even when that love was inconvenient. I wanted you to know that part of him too." They walked back to David's table together, Patricia squeezing his shoulder before she went to find her own seat. David sat down heavily, his whiskey glass still where he'd left it, but everything else feeling completely different. He watched Patricia across the room, chatting with other guests, laughing at someone's joke, being the perfect hostess she'd always been. But now he saw the weight she carried, the careful way she kept her real self hidden behind social graces. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. David made appropriate conversation, laughed at the best man's speech, and caught the bouquet when Elena threw it directly at his chest with a mischievous grin. But his mind was elsewhere, processing the revelation and what it meant for everything he thought he knew about his family. Marcus found him during the last dance, slightly drunk and gloriously happy. "Dave, man, thank you for being here. For being part of this. Elena and I were just saying how lucky we are to have friends like you." David hugged his best friend, feeling the weight of the secret Patricia had shared. "I'm happy for you, Marcus. Really happy. You okay, though? You seem a little off tonight." David glanced across the room where Patricia was dancing with her husband of 45 years, both of them moving with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to fit together over decades. "Just thinking about family stuff. You know how weddings make you contemplative." Marcus laughed. "Tell me about it. I've been emotional all day. Mom cried during the ceremony, which made me cry, which made Elena cry. It was like a waterworks convention up there." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. After the reception ended and the last guest departed, David helped clean up and load gifts into cars. Patricia approached him as he was carrying a box of leftover centerpieces to Marcus's car. "David, thank you for listening tonight, for letting me share that with you." He set the box down and looked at her. In the dim light of the parking lot, with her makeup slightly smudged and her perfect hair coming loose from its pins, she looked more human than he'd ever seen her. "Patricia, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do you regret it? The affair, I mean." She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful attention she'd given everything else that night. "I regret the pain it would have caused if people had known. I regret that your father had to choose between his family and what we had. But do I regret loving him? No. Even knowing how it ended, I don't regret that." David drove home through empty streets, his mind spinning with questions and implications. He'd grown up feeling like he was missing something essential, some connection to his father that photographs and stories couldn't provide. Now he had a piece of that connection, but it came with complications he wasn't sure how to process. His loft felt different when he walked in, as if the familiar space had shifted while he was gone. He made himself a cup of tea and sat on his couch, looking at the framed photograph of his parents that sat on his bookshelf. His mother, young and radiant and 8 months pregnant with him. His father, handsome in that effortless way some men possessed, his arm around her with a smile that David had always interpreted as pure happiness. Now he wondered what else that smile might have contained. Guilt? Uncertainty? Love for multiple people that couldn't be easily reconciled? David picked up his phone and scrolled to his mother's number, then set it down without calling. What would he say? How do you ask your mother if she knew her husband was in love with someone else? How do you share information that might shatter her memories of the only great love she'd ever known? Instead, he found himself thinking about Patricia, about the careful way she'd moved through Marcus's life all these years. How many family dinners had she attended where she had to look at David and remember the man she'd lost? How many times had she bitten back comments or memories that only she carried? The next morning, David woke with the strange feeling that he'd crossed some invisible threshold. The revelation from the wedding hadn't disappeared with sleep. If anything, it felt more solid and real in the bright light of Sunday morning. He made coffee, read the news, and went about his normal weekend routine, but everything felt slightly off-kilter, like walking on a ship in gentle swells. He found himself thinking about his father in new ways, not just as the tragic figure from his mother's stories, but as a complex person who'd made difficult choices and lived with their consequences. David realized he'd never really considered that his father might have been unhappy or conflicted or struggling with competing desires. In his mind, his father had been a simple story: loving husband, devoted father-to-be, life cut tragically short. But people weren't simple stories, David understood now. They were collections of contradictions and compromises, love and regret, the things they did and the things they wished they'd done differently. Around noon, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "David, this is Patricia. I got your number from Marcus. I wanted to thank you again for last night, and to say that if you ever want to talk more about your father, I have some things of his that your mother never knew about. Letters he wrote but never sent. Photographs from when we traveled together. I've kept them all these years, not sure what to do with them. They belong to you now if you want them." David stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'd like that. When would be a good time? Marcus and Elena are leaving for their honeymoon tomorrow. Would Tuesday work? I could meet you somewhere private." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Patricia's neighborhood, the kind of place where conversations could happen without interruption. David spent the rest of Sunday and all of Monday in a state of anxious anticipation, wondering what else he might learn about the father he'd never really known. Tuesday afternoon found him sitting across from Patricia in a corner booth, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them as she pulled items from a small wooden box she'd brought with her. "These are the letters he wrote to me but never gave me," she said, sliding a stack of envelopes across the table. He was always better at writing than talking when it came to difficult emotions. "And these are from a weekend we spent in Vancouver, about 6 months before he died." The photograph showed a younger version of Patricia and a man David recognized from his mother's pictures, but had never seen looking so relaxed and genuinely happy. They were sitting by water, walking through gardens, laughing at something outside the camera's view. In every picture, they looked like people who belonged together. "He was going to tell your mother about us after you were born," Patricia continued. "He said he wanted to be sure you and she were healthy and settled before he disrupted everything. He was terrified of hurting her, but he also couldn't continue living a lie. The accident happened 2 weeks before he planned to have that conversation." David picked up one of the letters, his father's handwriting neat and careful across the envelope. "May I?" Patricia nodded. "They're yours now." The letter was dated 3 months before David's birth. His father wrote about feeling torn between duty and desire, about loving Rachel but being in love with Patricia, about wanting to do the right thing while struggling to know what that meant. It was the voice of a man grappling with impossible choices, trying to find a path forward that wouldn't destroy the people he cared about. "He sounds miserable," David said after reading several pages. "He was, toward the end. We both were. Love isn't supposed to hurt that much, but sometimes it does when circumstances make it complicated." David looked through more photographs, seeing his father in contexts he'd never imagined. Not just as his mother's husband, or his own absent father, but as Patricia's lover, looking at her with an expression David had only seen in movies. "What happened to you after he died?" David asked. "How did you go on?" Patricia smiled sadly. "I grieved privately for 2 years. Then I decided I had to choose between destroying my family or learning to live with what I'd lost. I stayed with Marcus's father, tried to be a good wife and mother, but I never stopped missing your father. Some losses you don't recover from. You just learn to carry them better." They talked for 2 hours, Patricia sharing memories, and David asking questions he'd never known he wanted answered. She told him about his father's love of jazz music, his terrible cooking, his habit of leaving books half-finished all over the house, details that painted a fuller picture of the man David had inherited his eyes from. As they prepared to leave, Patricia handed him the wooden box. "There are more letters in here, and some other things. A watch he wore, a book he was reading, a map of places he wanted to travel to. I've kept them safe for 30 years, but they belong with you now." David accepted the box, feeling its weight both physically and emotionally. "Patricia, what do you want me to do with this information?" "About the affair, I mean." She considered the question with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. "Whatever feels right to you, David. Your mother deserves to remember your father, however brings her peace. But you deserve to know the whole story, the complicated truth about who he really was." That night, David sat in his loft, surrounded by pieces of his father's hidden life. Letters that revealed a man struggling with love and duty. Photographs that showed him genuinely happy. Personal items that made him feel real in ways David had never experienced before. He called his mother, something he did every Sunday but had skipped the day before because he wasn't sure how to talk to her with this new knowledge. "David, sweetheart, I was wondering where you were yesterday. How was Marcus's wedding?" "It was beautiful, Mom." "Really lovely ceremony." They talked about the usual things, his work, her garden, plans for the upcoming holidays. But David found himself listening differently, hearing his mother's voice with new awareness of what she'd lost and what she'd never known she'd lost. "Mom, can I ask you something about Dad?" "Of course, honey. What would you like to know?" David paused, looking at one of the photographs Patricia had given him. His father looked so young, so uncertain, so human. "Were you too happy?" "Really happy, I mean. Not just the storybook version you usually tell me." His mother was quiet for a moment. "We were happy, David, but no relationship is perfect. Your father was a complicated man, thoughtful and kind, but sometimes distant. Like he was carrying something heavy that he couldn't share. I always wondered if it was just his nature, or if there was something specific troubling him." David felt a stab of understanding. His mother had sensed something, even if she'd never known what it was. "Do you miss him still?" "Every day. But I've built a good life around that missing piece. Sometimes that's all you can do." After they hung up, David sat with his father's letters and tried to imagine how different all their lives might have been if the accident hadn't happened. Would his father have left his mother for Patricia? Would David have grown up with a different understanding of love and loyalty? Would the three adults have found some way to navigate the complicated situation that honored everyone's feelings? There were no answers to those questions, but David found himself grateful for the complexity. His father wasn't a saint or a villain, just a person who'd loved him perfectly and tried to do right by everyone, even when that was impossible. Over the following weeks, David found himself changed by what he'd learned. Not dramatically, but in subtle ways that affected how he moved through the world. He was more patient with friends going through relationship struggles, more understanding when people made choices that seemed inconsistent with their stated values. He'd learned that love wasn't always simple or convenient, that good people sometimes found themselves in impossible situations. He also started visiting Patricia occasionally, not because he felt obligated, but because he enjoyed her company. She had stories about his father that no one else could tell, but more than that, she was interesting in her own right. Funny and sharp and surprisingly modern in her thinking despite her old-fashioned elegance. Marcus noticed the friendship and was delighted. "I'm so glad you and Mom are spending time together. She's been different since the wedding, happier somehow. Elena thinks having you around reminds her of when you and I were kids and she had someone to take care of." David smiled and didn't correct him. Patricia was happier, but not because she was taking care of anyone. She was happier because she'd finally shared her secret, finally had someone who knew the full story of the great love of her life. 3 months after the wedding, David received a call from his mother. She was cleaning out her closet and had found a box of his father's things she'd forgotten about. "There are some letters in here, David. Love letters he wrote to me while we were dating. Would you like me to read you some of them?" David almost said yes, then stopped himself. He'd already heard his father's voice in letters, had already glimpsed the man behind the stories. His mother's letters were hers to keep, her version of his father to preserve. "Keep them, Mom. Read them when you miss him. They're yours. You're a good son, David. Your father would be proud of the man you've become." David thought about that as he hung up the phone. His father would probably be surprised by the man David had become, would never have imagined that his secret love affair would eventually become a source of connection and understanding rather than shame and division. 6 months after the wedding, David ran into Elena at a coffee shop near his office. She was glowing with early pregnancy happiness, excited to share the news that she and Marcus were expecting their first child. "I keep thinking about the wedding," she said as they sat with their drinks. "How perfect everything was, how happy everyone looked. Your dance with Patricia was so sweet. She told me later that it meant a lot to her, having you there." David smiled. "She's a special woman. I'm glad we got to share that moment." "She is special. Marcus doesn't always appreciate how much she sacrificed over the years, staying in a marriage that wasn't always easy, putting everyone else's happiness before her own. But I think she's finally found some peace with her choices." David nodded, understanding more than Elena realized. Patricia had found peace, not by forgetting her lost love, but by sharing it with someone who could appreciate its complexity without judging its consequences. A year after the wedding, David received an invitation to Marcus and Elena's baby shower. Patricia had helped organize it, and when David arrived, she greeted him with a warm hug and the easy affection they'd developed over months of coffee dates and long conversations. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked, and David knew she was asking about more than just his day or his work. "I'm good, Patricia, really good. Thank you for trusting me with your story." She smiled. "Thank you for listening, and for understanding that love doesn't always look the way we think it should." As David watched her interact with the other guests, helping with food and making sure everyone felt welcome, he marveled at her grace. She'd carried a secret love for 30 years, raised a son who never knew about her divided heart, stayed in a marriage that was comfortable but not passionate, and somehow managed to do it all with dignity and kindness. The baby shower was lovely, full of laughter and gifts and excitement for the new life that was coming. David sat with Patricia during the gift opening, both of them watching Marcus and Elena with the shared knowledge that love takes many forms and that families are built from more than just blood and legal documents. Later, as David was getting ready to leave, Patricia walked him to his car. "David, I want you to know that telling you about your father was the best decision I've made in years. Not because it changed anything practical, but because it meant I didn't have to carry that love alone anymore." David looked at this woman who had become such an important part of his life in such an unexpected way. "I'm glad you told me. It helped me understand him, but it also helped me understand that people are more complicated than we usually give them credit for." Your father would be proud of how you've handled all this. You have his kindness, but more wisdom than he had at your age." David drove home, thinking about the strange turns life could take. A simple dance at a wedding had led to a revelation that changed how he understood his family, but more than that, it had given him a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human relationships. Love wasn't always simple or convenient, but it was always worth honoring, even when it came with complications. 2 years after the wedding, David stood in his own small apartment, now filled with photographs and mementos that told the full story of his father. Not just the heroic figure from his mother's memories, but the complicated man who'd loved deeply and struggled with impossible choices. The wooden box Patricia had given him sat on his bookshelf, holding letters and photographs that had helped him understand that his father had been fully human, flawed and loving, and trying his best in difficult circumstances. David had learned to carry this knowledge lightly, not as a burden but as a gift. He'd gained not just information about his father, but a relationship with Patricia that enriched both their lives. She'd found someone who could appreciate the full story of her great love, and he'd found a connection to his father that went beyond the simplified narratives he'd grown up with. Sometimes the most important truths came not from dramatic revelations but from quiet conversations, from the courage to share complicated stories, from the willingness to listen without judgment. A single dance at a wedding had opened a door to understanding that David never could have imagined, but once opened, had made everything else make more sense. The truth Patricia had shared that night wasn't just about his father's affair or her hidden love. It was about the complexity of human hearts, the way people could love multiple people in different ways, the courage it took to carry difficult secrets, and the relief that came from finally sharing them with someone who could understand. David kept the story private, respecting both his mother's memories and Patricia's dignity. But he carried the lessons with him into every relationship that followed. Love was complicated, people were flawed, and sometimes the most beautiful connections came from the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.